Hi, and thanks for watching our webinar on document compliance. Before we get started, I'll briefly go over the agenda. We're going to talk about what PDF accessibility is, just to make sure we're all on the same page with that. And then we'll talk more generally about what's driving the demand for accessibility, what the various regulations and standards are, how organizations can go about making sure that their PDFs are accessible, including some challenges that you may face, creating and implementing a plan of attack, and providing some tips to help you be successful. I'll also explain a little bit about what CommonLook has to offer and what sets us apart from others in the field. First, a little about who we are. I'm Paul, and I'm the training manager with CommonLook. Since joining the team in 2013, I've worked with a variety of healthcare organizations, local, state, and federal government agencies, financial institutions, colleges and universities, and other groups to assist them in meeting their accessibility needs. That being said, my degree is actually in instrumental music education, and before joining the CommonLook team, I was a middle school band teacher for 11 years. While that might be fascinating trivia, and people often ask how I got from music to software, the point in mentioning my background is this. I'm not a rocket scientist. I'm not a software developer, and I don't have an IT background. As we go through today's webinar, you might find yourself getting a little confused, a little overwhelmed at times. That's understandable. Accessibility can be a confusing thing. But if this band guy can get it, so can you. It might take some time, it might take some work, and you might have to ask a bunch of questions. That's okay. We want you to know that we're here for you to answer your questions and provide help and guidance as needed. Of course, we say that we're here to help, but who is CommonLook? We'll get into more detail about what we do and how we do it later in the presentation, but in a nutshell, we've been in the PDF accessibility space since about 1995. During that time, we've worked with thousands of clients in a wide range of industries, helping them solve their PDF accessibility challenges. Not only do we provide software, training, services, and other innovative solutions to help our clients make sure that their PDFs are accessible, but we also helped write the book on what PDF accessibility means and how to achieve it. So, just so that we're on the same page here, what is PDF accessibility? What's interesting about this is that different people have different answers to that question. I was at a healthcare convention a couple of years ago now, manning our booth, and at one point the director of a hospital wandered on by. I struck up a conversation with him, asking who he is, what in the healthcare field he does, and so on, and kind of the no-brainer question, I asked him if he uses PDFs. So, of course, he said yes, and I asked the obvious follow-up question, are they accessible? He responded with, well, I can open them whenever I need to. But document accessibility goes beyond making sure people can just find them and open them. It also means making sure that everyone can read them. And we mean everyone, including people who are blind, visually impaired, or have any other disability. Not only do the documents that you have on your website need to be accessible, but your PDFs that aren't public or forward-facing have to be accessible as well. We have to make sure that everyone has access to the information that they need. This slide here has some interesting and perhaps eye-opening statistics. For example, the World Health Organization states that almost everyone at some point in life will be temporarily or permanently disabled. 1 out of every 7 people in the world are currently living with some sort of disability. 285 million people are visually impaired, and 360 million people have to deal with some kind of hearing loss. There are other things not on this slide that I could mention, like the fact that women, the elderly, and the poor are disproportionately affected, or that children from poorer households, indigenous populations, and people in ethnic minority groups are at a significantly higher risk of having a disability. But you know what? I'm not a numbers guy, and some of that information is too impersonal. What really drives the point home to me is when I interact with or hear stories about people who have disabilities and the challenges that they face. A while back, I was in LA to teach some classes, and I was in the cab from the airport to my hotel, and as I like to do, I struck up a conversation with the cab driver. Of course, the conversation made its way around to what are you doing in town? What do you do for a living? And so on. So I gave him my little 30-second elevator pitch that I'm the training manager for a software company and that our software is used to test, create, and remediate PDFs so that people who are blind, visually impaired, or have other disabilities can read them. He thought that was pretty amazing, as many people do, and he went on to tell me about when he was in college living in the dorm. Down the hall from him lived a fellow student who was blind, and perhaps due to the technology available or not available at the time, or maybe due to lack of other resources, this student had to rely on other college kids, classmates, friends, kids on work study, to read him his textbooks and assignments. And the cab driver told me how painfully frustrating it was for this kid who wanted nothing more than to do well in school, earn his degree, and advance his life when people wouldn't show up to read him his stuff. The cabbie was telling me that this student got so frustrated that he'd punch walls and throw chairs. I can only imagine how frustrating that would be. At the same time, it gives me great pride and satisfaction knowing that what we do is making a difference, making life better for other people, perhaps giving them a little more independence and making available opportunities that some people may not otherwise have. To me, that's the reason for this, in real and concrete terms. Now, disability comes in many forms. Some are illustrated on this slide here, along with some accessibility solutions. And interestingly enough, all of these apply to PDFs. For example, screen readers or Braille can be helpful for people who are blind or visually impaired. Because it's possible to embed a video in a PDF, captions are needed for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Documents have to be navigable and usable by keyboard only, as well as with a mouse, especially if those documents contain links or fillable form fields. And authors need to make sure that documents are well formatted, not only for people who have dyslexia or other cognitive disabilities, but also with regard to if and how colors being used and whether the contrast between foreground and background is sufficient. As it says near the bottom of this slide, the critical challenge is in making sure that documents are accessible and usable by everyone. There's a lot to consider while we're doing that. More on that later. As mentioned, there are a lot of things to take into consideration so that electronic documents are accessible, and as this slide shows, if we drop the ball on that, then people could be missing out on something important. But accessible design isn't just for people who have disabilities. Accessible design makes things better for everyone. Furthermore, not only is making things accessible a good business practice or the right thing to do, but it's also the law. I'd imagine that we're all at least a little familiar with ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Title III focuses on places of public accommodation, which is actually a very broad term that applies to movie theaters, banks, grocery stores, restaurants, and more. The focus of ADA Title II is state and local government, including school districts, colleges and universities, and so on. Back in 1990, when the ADA was enacted, the internet wasn't anywhere near as popular as it is now. And to paraphrase from the text of Title II and Title III, while the language of the ADA does not explicitly mention the internet, the Department of Justice has taken the position that both Title II and Title III covers internet websites. By extension, anything on those websites needs to be accessible too, and that's one situation in which PDF accessibility comes into play. Because the ADA applies to websites, and perhaps because more and more people with disabilities are going online nowadays, accessibility is getting a lot more attention. As a result, there have been a lot of lawsuits recently over inaccessible websites and or mobile apps. As this slide indicates, in 2016, there were approximately 6,600 ADA lawsuits, which is a 38% increase from just the year before. In addition, there have been some landmark cases recently, a very notable one being the Winn-Dixie case, in which a judge ruled that their website is a place of public accommodation and therefore it needs to be accessible. While the plaintiff in the case didn't receive any financial compensation, Winn-Dixie has been ordered to fix their website so that it's accessible. One of the things that makes this such an important case is that it's the first lawsuit to go to trial, whereas in the past, cases have been settled before that point. This time, however, Winn-Dixie tried to fight it, they went to court, and they lost. This will not only end up costing Winn-Dixie money to get their website compliant, but also cost them in legal fees and in the court of public opinion. Of course, grocery store chains aren't the only businesses or organizations that have had legal action brought against them. Increasingly, there have been lawsuits brought in other industries, such as restaurants, the medical field, hospitality, and even in higher education, with many colleges and universities being sued for things like inaccessible websites, course materials, and classroom equipment. Of course, not only do public-facing PDFs on your website need to be accessible, but also consider documents that are sent to individuals or various groups, as well as those that are for internal use. So if people are getting sued, there's got to be laws about this, right? I've already mentioned the ADA and that it not only applies to physical locations, but also to websites and electronic content. In the federal government, there's Section 508, which states that anything on a government website that's available to the public, as well as pretty much anything internal, has to be accessible. In addition, programs and things that get federal funding have to be 508 compliant as well. This is particularly relevant to health insurance companies, for example. You know all those books, brochures, and forms you get during open enrollment? They have to be accessible. Now, one thing that can be confusing about Section 508 is that it's not only a law that stuff has to be accessible, but it's also a standard, the how-to for making things accessible for the federal government. Of course, in 2017, the Section 508 standard was refreshed or brought up to date, and now the how-to part of 508 directly references WCAG 2.0. To explain WCAG a little further, WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and it's pretty much the international standard for website accessibility. Created by the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, was originally designed, as the name states, for web content, HTML. The whole idea was to increase web accessibility for everyone, whether or not they have a disability. There are four main guiding principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. In a nutshell, perceivable means that content can't be hidden from all senses. Operable means that people need to be able to operate the website, follow the links, navigate, etc. Understandable means that content needs to be written at a reading level such that people can comprehend it. Finally, robust means that the content has to be able to be viewed on various machines and platforms, think smartphones, tablets, and laptops, and that as technology advances, content that was once accessible can't become inaccessible. Within these four principles are 12 guidelines, and each guideline has testable success criteria at three different levels: A, AA, and AAA. The A level is pretty much the bare minimum to make content accessible. The AA level is the middle of the road, and it ensures that content is not only accessible, but also more usable than it might be at the A level. The AAA level is WCAG's highest level of accessibility and the hardest to achieve. In fact, it might not always be achievable for every checkpoint, and seeing as a website would have to pass every checkpoint at the AAA level to be AAA conformant, the standard that the world uses and the new 508 refresh has adopted is WCAG 2.0 AA. Now, while WCAG was originally developed for HTML, it applies really well to PDF too. And then there's PDF UA, an accessibility standard specific to PDF, where the UA stands for Universal Accessibility. It's a really rigorous technical standard geared toward developers and authors implementing PDF writing and processing software. As such, it provides definitive terms and requirements for accessibility in PDF documents and applications. Aside from introductory sections and glossaries, there's three main sections that most people care about. From a developer standpoint, you might care about the section pertaining to how PDF rendering software should display the PDF. You might also care about the section that discusses how assistive technology should handle PDFs. Or, from a PDF testing and remediation standpoint, you might be most interested in the section that addresses PDF accessibility at the document and tagging level. So, awesome, here we are. Maybe a little confused and a little overwhelmed with everything that I've mentioned. Certainly, along the way, there are going to be some challenges that you'll want to overcome. Knowing or figuring out where you're vulnerable is important so that you can tackle those issues and reduce your legal risk. Of course, knowing the standards, how to meet them, and so on too, can be quite a challenge. Also, coming up with the resources, people, time, and money to address issues could be a challenge as well. What's presented on this slide here is a multi-phase plan to achieve document accessibility. Phase 1, review and assess. Phase 2, strategy and plan. Phase 3, implement. Phase 4, expand the program. And Phase 5, monitor and report. In the next few slides, we'll dissect this plan and take a closer look at key items in each step. In Phase 1, you're going to do things like set the goals for your organization, choose what standard you want to conform to, and test your documents to see where you stand. First, a brief word about choosing your standard. You may be asking, seeing as both WCAG and PDF UA will work for PDF, which should I choose? That partially depends on who you ask. According to the Association for Information and Image Management, they say choose the standard developed specifically for that particular technology. For your PDFs, that would be PDF UA, but for the rest of your website, for example, you'd have to go with WCAG. Interestingly, when the U.S. Access Board was refreshing the 508 standard, they specifically decided to not go with PDF UA and stayed with WCAG for PDFs. Why is that? One of the main reasons was for consistency's sake, so that there's only one standard that has to be really understood and mastered for all of the content to be accessible. And because, for example, a video can be embedded in a PDF, if PDFs have to be PDF UA conformant, then that's fine, but then the video in the PDF would have to be WCAG conformant. Things could get pretty confusing pretty quickly. So the Access Board says that WCAG 2.0 AA is good enough for electronic content, whether that's HTML or PDF. However, they do also say that WCAG 2.0 is the minimum, and if agencies or departments want to choose a higher standard, they can. In addition, because PDF UA is pretty much seen as the gold standard for PDF accessibility, it's pretty picky and can be really confusing. Seeing as Section 508 and the ADA both refer to, or at least mention, WCAG 2.0 AA, if you make your PDFs conformant at least at that level, then you should be good to go. So also in Phase 1 is testing your documents to get a read on where you stand. But when it comes to the actual testing, do you do it yourself or should you hire someone else? If you know where all of your documents are, if you have the time and the expertise, and if you have access to trustworthy tools, then maybe it would be worth it to do the testing yourself. However, some organizations don't even know how many PDFs they have, where they are. There's way too many to test, or perhaps all of this is new to you. For any or all of those reasons, it might be better to outsource the work to someone who's set up to do it and do it well. If you choose to take on the work yourselves, there are tools available such as Adobe Acrobat, the PAC2 checker, and the Common Look PDF Validator that you might consider using. Of course, some tools are better than others, and along with learning about the various accessibility standards themselves, it's important to keep in mind that most testing tools and remediation tools, when we get to talking about that phase, are going to have a learning curve associated with them. So with Phase 1, choosing your standard, testing, and so on complete, we move on to Phase 2. Here is where you'll come up with your remediation strategy to fix the problem documents that you found. And, as in Phase 1, the question is, do you do the work internally or do you outsource it? Clearly, there are pros and cons to each approach. If you decide to do it yourself, there are essentially two tools available to help make the job easier. One is Adobe Acrobat, and the other is CommonLook PDF Global Access. If you know what you're doing, or if you have the time and resources to learn, then doing it internally can help to build the strength and knowledge that you, your team, and your organization possesses. Of course, therein lies the challenge too, the time, effort, and training needed. Some organizations will take a blended approach in which they outsource some of the more challenging documents while they get up to speed internally on the less complicated ones. Outsourcing, especially to a reputable contractor or vendor, can make life a lot easier for you, can make the remediation process go a whole lot faster, and if the vendor guarantees and stands behind their work, then this can help to mitigate your legal risk. However, outsourcing could be expensive, requires time, depending on your procurement requirements, this could be a lot of time, and you really want to be careful about who you hire. A lot of contractors or vendors claim to be able to make PDFs accessible, but then in reality, they fall short of the mark. Of course, you're going to do your due diligence. So continuing on in the PDF accessibility process, now that you've started fixing your PDFs, or maybe you've gotten them all fixed and that situation is under control, the next thing is to make sure that PDFs that are created in the future are accessible as well. The best way to go about this is to take a proactive approach during document design and creation, as opposed to just making the PDFs and then fixing them later. Training your document creators, designers, and authors is an important step here. Lots of times when I teach PDF remediation classes, the document designers are the ones that then have to fix their own messes. Oftentimes in class, when I teach what has to be done to fix something, I hear people making the connections of, oh, if I do this when I'm creating the document, then I wouldn't have to do all of that to fix it later. Because you're starting to take a proactive approach, it'll end up saving your organization time and money in the end. It's important to keep accessibility in mind while you're creating your document. Use styles where you can. Use list creating functionality when it's available. Be aware of color use, contrast between foreground and background, and add accurate alternative text to your images. Thankfully, there are a number of tools to help you at this stage too. Depending on what software you're using, Microsoft Office products have checkers built in. They don't assure conformance to a particular standard, but they're better than nothing. Also, CommonLook has a plugin for Word and PowerPoint to make your standard conformant PDF directly from either of those applications. If you're using InDesign, I hear good things about Made to Tag. Now, to be fair, I don't use InDesign, so I've never checked out Made to Tag, but like I said, I hear good things. There are other tools out there too, depending on what authoring software you're using. The point is, find them, learn about them, and consider using them. In Phase 4, you're continuing to ramp up your accessibility efforts, knowledge, and expertise. Maybe if you decided to outsource your testing and remediation before, you'll look into bringing it in-house during this phase. You'll also want to check in with other departments and make sure that accessibility is making its way through the organization and that there's a consistent, cohesive approach. Finally, Phase 5, monitoring and reporting. It's important for organizations to not only find and test their PDFs, but also to keep track of things so that as more PDFs are put up online, you're sure that they're accessible as well. In fact, you may recall earlier when I mentioned some of the organizations and industries that have been sued in recent years. In all of those cases, part of their settlement agreements included specific requirements for continued monitoring of the website, course materials, and so on. Not only is it important to confirm that your PDFs have been fixed correctly and new PDFs are accessible, but you'll also want to create and or maintain compliance data in case a legal situation comes up. One word of caution regarding this phase. if you decide to outsource your scanning and monitoring, make sure that the people testing your PDFs really understand PDF. There are a lot of companies who will test the HTML side of websites, and many of them will claim to check the PDFs too, but unless they really understand the intricacies of PDF accessibility, you could still be vulnerable. A very important aspect of accessibility work to keep in mind is this. PDF accessibility cannot be achieved 100% with automation, and that includes the testing and remediation work. If anyone tells you that their accessibility solutions are 100% automated and that their automation is 100% comprehensive and accurate, they either don't really understand PDF accessibility or they're lying to you and probably trying to sell you something. If you're going to outsource this part, make sure you choose a vendor and or products that will really test and monitor things accurately. Back when we were talking about testing in phase 1, the tools that I mentioned are all for testing individual PDFs. There are vendors, software products, and services out there to test PDFs in bulk, but again, you want to be careful, ask the right questions, and do your due diligence. As I've said before, if they're claiming to test and verify 100% through automation, don't trust them. Machines can't test everything. For example, the color checkpoint can be a tricky one. The rule is don't use color as the only way of conveying information. The problem here is that while a machine can automatically test and detect color changes in a document, the only way to tell whether or not color is the only way that information is being conveyed is to actually look at the document, read it, and figure it out from there. Similarly, the only way to verify that the reading order in a PDF is correct is to look at the physical view of the PDF. That's what you'd print out or what you look at on your computer screen. Examine the tags and make sure that the order of the tags in the tags tree makes sense based on that physical view. These things simply cannot be tested and verified 100% without human interaction. So here you go. You're dangerously informed, and now it's time to take action. This slide is basically a recap of what we've gone over. Verify, remediate either in-house or through outsourcing, and continue to learn standards, practices, tools, and so on. Little by little, as you get more familiar with the whole idea, you can bring more in-house if you so choose. So from a high-level approach, here are some tips for your organization and the people in it. Create a team so you don't have to fight this fight or learn everything by yourself. Get the bosses on board early so that they know it's important, why it's important, and so that when decisions, perhaps cuts, have to be made further down the line, accessibility maintains its importance and its place. Invest in the people and the tools to be able to do it right. And when outsourcing, be sure to do your research and choose a partner who really knows their stuff, especially when it comes to the complexities of PDF. Finally, embed the need for accessibility into your corporate values so that everyone understands the need and everyone is on board. Similarly, when it comes to the documents themselves, it's helpful to be aware of your document inventory, which documents are higher priority, and what standard to use. Not only is choosing the correct standard important, by the way, but when outsourcing, you'll want to make sure that you're very specific with your vendor regarding project needs, how you're going to verify that the work has been done correctly, and so on. From a legal risk standpoint, tackle the low-hanging fruit right away. If people are on your website and they can easily find inaccessible stuff, that makes you an easy target. Similarly, fix the documents, both public and internal, that everyone needs to read. Then, if your remediation project includes a lot of files, knock the easy ones out quickly. These are the ones with only a few pages, mostly straight text with maybe only a couple of images, nothing too complex. Use these documents to test your contractors and see how they do on the more simple and probably cheaper ones before you give them the documents that are longer or harder and more expensive to fix. Remember, too, to design with accessibility in mind. It just makes things better for everyone, whether or not they have any disabilities. And make sure that you're checking your work along the way so that you don't get to the end of a project and then have to go back and fix stuff. Addressing accessibility at the end instead of at the beginning of your project can really slow things down and make things more expensive, as deadlines have to be pushed back and quite possibly things need to be redesigned. Also, keep checking along the way to catch anything that pops up before it's too late. So I've mentioned having vendors or contractors do the work for you. You may be wondering who's available for the job. You'll probably fairly easily find a number of vendors who will tell you that they do PDF accessibility. As I mentioned before, you're going to want to do your research. That said, CommonLook is the industry leader not only in software tools, training, and expertise, but also in remediation services. Whether you want to do the work yourselves, have us do it, or take a blended approach where we fix the tricky stuff while you take care of the easier things, or while you learn how to do the more complex documents yourselves, we've got you covered. If you want to fix your own documents, our software solutions will help you do this with unmatched speed, efficiency, and accuracy. In fact, the W3C recommends our CommonLook software products not only for creating accessible PDFs from Microsoft Word and PowerPoint, but also for remediating PDFs no matter what the source. And thinking back to the other tools that I mentioned earlier, the CommonLook tools are the only ones that will guarantee your documents conform with Section 508, WCAG 2.0 AA, PDF UA, and the standard that the U.S. Health and Human Services Agency uses as well. In addition, our training department can teach you anything from the most basic concepts in accessibility to how to fix the most complex documents. You can come to our classes in Washington, D.C., or we will gladly come to you. If you're having us do the work, we'll get it done quickly, having the capacity to remediate over 3,000 pages per day. And not only are we going to do the work right, but we'll also stand behind what we do with a guarantee that your documents are accessible and standards conformant. Unlike other companies, PDF accessibility is the only thing that we do. We've been doing it since 1999, and in fact, our Chief Technical Officer sits on the PDF UA board and is responsible for writing various checkpoints in the standards, such as how complex tables and charts should be made accessible. No matter how you decide to utilize us, we'll help you make sure your PDFs are accessible, they conform to whatever standard you choose, and we'll even provide compliance reports so that you know your documents have been fixed and you have that assurance if a legal situation were to arise. So I hope that you found this helpful and informative. I know I've thrown a lot of information out there at you. I hope it wasn't too overwhelming. For help, advice, software, training, to have us fix your PDFs for you, or for a combination of any of those things, please don't hesitate to contact us. As I've said before, PDF accessibility is our passion, and it's all we do. If we can be of any help, please contact your account executive, or if you don't have one, send an email to info@commonlook.com. Thanks for watching.